this week's It's the Law, we're talking to attorney Jay Davis about stand your ground laws, like the one surrounding the shooting of Trayvon Martin. Earlier in the show, we took you to a ceremony here in Middle Georgia where people were taking a stand against the shooting. And these types of protests have been going on all over the nation. The 17-year-old was shot and killed near Orlando by a neighborhood watch volunteer in February. That volunteer, George Zimmerman, claimed self-defense, but demonstrators want the shooter arrested. Because of Florida's law, if arrested, Zimmerman could claim self-defense and be set free. Good evening. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Corinne.
Now tell me, if this were to happen in Georgia, the same situation, are there stand your ground laws here that would come into play?
There are. The actual law that should come into play is murder or self-defense, of course, and those are virtually universal in the states in the United States. However, stand your ground is a relatively new law. About 14 states have adopted it, Georgia having followed suit shortly after Florida. I believe Georgia's began in 2006. And they came about because people, if you may remember before the law, assumed if somebody was breaking in their home, they would shoot them. A lot of people joked that I would go and drag them into the house because there was a lot of laws protecting someone who fell outside or was shot on the outside of someone's property. The stand your ground laws allowed someone to be protected if they shoot somebody in self-defense in their home, against their person, or against particular property, some property, when the threat of force is there.
All right, it's kind of confusing. What would you say the main difference is, what we're seeing on TV and what's going on in Florida, if it were to happen in Georgia? What should we understand?
Well, under the law, there's very little difference between the Florida law and the Georgia law. I've looked over the Florida law. Of course, I'm not licensed to practice in Florida, but I've looked over both laws, and they're very, very similar. But the thing is a stand your ground law comes into play when someone has aggressively come after you. So in order for stand your ground laws to even come into play, there has to be an assertion that Trayvon Martin came after George Zimmerman in some aggressive manner. If that's not the case, then stand your ground laws actually are not necessarily into effect. Okay. However, the law does protect. It actually gives immunity from prosecution from the person who asserts that. So if he was to be prosecuted and it was to prove otherwise, that he was actually defending himself or that Trayvon came after him aggressively, then he may could turn around and sue for a wrongful prosecution.
Okay, so protesters, like we heard from earlier in this broadcast, they want to know why Zimmerman hasn't been arrested yet. What would you say to that?
I would say probably that you have to look back at what the prosecution has. And the prosecution needs to, in my opinion as a defense attorney, before arresting someone, needs to know that they have the evidence against someone. And they probably should spend a little bit of time figuring out if they do. I regularly have cases that come to me where there was an arrest made, a prosecution begun, on someone who there was no evidence ultimately to go to trial with, and we are in trial before a jury trying to claim there's no evidence here. And often we're right on that assertion.
Right.
So from a defense attorney, I would say I would like the idea that the prosecution has the evidence first before they make the arrest.
Real quickly, I want to get to one of our viewer questions. We're going to completely switch gears here. This question's from Susan from Byron, and she asks, my son was circumcised in the hospital after he was born. Now, 6 years later, he has to have surgery because he has meatal stenosis. Could we have a malpractice suit against the hospital and or doctor?
Well, that's a good question. The question is going to boil down to is meatal stenosis, and what is it, and what are the likelihood after a circumcision that might take place. And I didn't know this prior to the question. I had to do a little research to find out what it was myself, and it's actually a problem that occurs with urination in a child. Usually it may be done when they're circumcised directly after birth, but it doesn't evidence itself until somewhere around 4 to 7 years old.
All right.
It's a common occurrence, according to what I've read. It happens in about 10% of children. And that being a normal risk, an expected risk of a circumcision, likely doesn't give you a suit against a doctor or the hospital.
Well, that's all we have time for. Interesting stuff there. Thanks for joining us. And to submit your legal questions, you can send an email to itsthelaw@41nbc.com.